A sophisticated global network vanished almost overnight. The Late Bronze Age collapse is one of history's deepest mysteries, a catastrophe that erased 5 mighty empires and plunged the known world into a centuries-long dark age. By the end of this journey, you will understand how a perfect storm of disasters can unravel even the greatest civilizations and what that means for our world today. We will explore vibrant, interconnected kingdoms that traded across continents and decode the frantic last messages they left behind in clay and stone. What single force could topple such powerful and interconnected kingdoms? Did they fall to mysterious invaders, a changing climate, or did they crumble from within? This story is a puzzle written in ruins, and its solution challenges everything we think we know about resilience and collapse. What does it feel like to watch an entire age come to an end? That glittering web of power had a name among those who ruled it. Historians today call it the International Age, but the kings of the time knew it as the Club of the Great Powers. It was the world's first true geopolitical system, a delicate dance of diplomacy and commerce stretching from the Nile Delta to the Aegean Sea. Think of it as a kind of ancient United Nations, but one held together by royal marriages, extravagant gifts, and the constant exchange of letters written on clay tablets. The archives of these empires are filled with correspondence that sounds remarkably modern. One Hittite king writes to the pharaoh of Egypt, addressing him as "my brother," and complains that the gold statues he sent were not nearly heavy enough. An Egyptian queen writes to the king of a neighboring land, detailing a shopping list for fine oils and precious woods. This was not mere barter. It was a complex economy of prestige and obligation that kept the peace. At the heart of this system was a single, crucial commodity: bronze. Bronze is an alloy, a mixture of copper and tin, and it was the absolute foundation of their world. From it, they forged everything that defined their civilizations: the swords of their soldiers, the plows of their farmers, the tools of their artisans, and the ceremonial vessels of their temples. But here was the catch. While copper mines were scattered around the Mediterranean, the tin needed to make bronze was extraordinarily rare. Major sources were located only in distant, difficult places like modern-day Afghanistan and perhaps Cornwall in Britain. This meant the entire club of the great powers depended on long, fragile supply chains that snaked across mountains and seas. A disruption in that tin trade would be like cutting the power grid for a modern city. Everything would slowly, then suddenly, grind to a halt. The members of this club were the superstars of the ancient world. There was New Kingdom Egypt, at the height of its imperial power under pharaohs like Ramesses II, its granaries full and its monuments reaching for the sky. To the north, in the rugged highlands of Anatolia, sat the Hittite Empire, masters of ironworking and formidable charioteers, locked in a tense stalemate with Egypt. Further east lay the ancient cultural heartlands of Mesopotamia, home to the Middle Assyrian Empire, a fiercely disciplined military state, and Kassite Babylonia, a center of learning and astronomy. And across the wine-dark sea, in the rocky peninsulas of Greece, the Mycenaean civilization thrived in its fortified palace complexes, like Mycenae and Pylos, where Linear B script kept records of spices, textiles, and chariot wheels. These were not backward kingdoms. They were sophisticated, literate, and deeply connected. They shared artistic styles, medical knowledge, and even religious ideas. The world for them was stable, predictable, and prosperous. So what could possibly threaten such an established, interlinked order? The answer lies not in a single enemy at the gates, but in a series of quiet cracks that began to spread through the very foundations of their age. To understand how the collapse could reach even the mightiest, we must first visit its most powerful member, The new kingdom of Egypt was the undisputed superpower of its day, a land of staggering wealth and divine kings whose very word was believed to shape the cosmos. Under Pharaoh Ramesses II, Egypt's influence stretched from the gold mines of Nubia in the south to the bustling ports of the Levant in the north. Its stability was a marvel of the ancient world, engineered by the relentless, predictable heartbeat of the Nile River. Each year, the floodwaters would rise, depositing rich, black silt across the farmland, guaranteeing a harvest that fed millions and filled the state's granaries to overflowing. This agricultural miracle funded everything from the colossal temples at Karnak and Luxor to the professional army that projected Egyptian power far beyond its borders. That military might was famously tested at the Battle of Kadesh, a clash against the rival Hittite Empire. Though the battle ended in a stalemate, it was a spectacle of Bronze Age warfare on an almost unimaginable scale, involving perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 chariots thundering across the plain. The very fact that two empires could field and sustain such forces speaks to the incredible resources and organization of this international age. Egypt was not just rich, it was the central bank and breadbasket of the known world. Yet within a few generations the cracks began to show. By the time of Ramesses III, great-grandson of the legendary Ramesses II, the empire was under a different kind of pressure. The royal tombs, once unimaginably lavish, became more modest. The state, which had always relied on its own people, now increasingly hired foreign fighters for its defense, groups the Egyptian records mysteriously call the Sea Peoples. This was a profound shift. It suggests the pool of loyal Egyptian soldiers may have been shrinking, or that the threats were becoming so frequent and severe that the homeland army could not handle them alone. The mighty Nile continued to flood, but the system built upon it was starting to creak. The pharaoh, once an invincible god-king, now had to bargain with temple priests and provincial governors for support. The gold from Nubia still flowed, but so did the costs of maintaining a vast empire in a world growing more unstable by the year. Egypt remained formidable, a fortress of civilization, but the fortress walls were now manned by mercenaries, and the horizon beyond them was darkening with unknown storms. Meanwhile, high on the windswept plateau of Anatolia, another of the great powers faced a very different kind of vulnerability. The Hittite kingdom of Hatti was a landlocked empire of rugged mountains and deep valleys, a realm that ruled not by the gentle predictability of a river, but by sheer political will and military innovation. Their capital, Hattusa, was a masterpiece of defensive engineering, a sprawling fortress city with walls that seemed to grow from the very cliffs, its gates guarded by towering stone lions and sphinxes. Inside those walls lay one of the ancient world's great libraries, a vast archive of thousands of clay tablets. These were not just royal boasts or epic poems, they were the meticulous paperwork of empire, recording everything from sacred oaths to vassal treaties, from laws about farm animals to inventories of temple silver. The Hittites were brilliant administrators, holding together a patchwork of subordinate kingdoms through a complex web of loyalty, oaths, and strategic marriages. Their other great advantage was technological. They were among the first to master the large-scale production of iron, a metal harder and more durable than bronze, giving their weapons and tools a significant edge. Yet for all their administrative genius and martial prowess, the Hittite Empire had a fundamental geographical weakness. The rocky Anatolian plateau was not Egypt's lush Nile Valley. Its harvests were far less reliable. To feed the population of Hattusa and maintain its large professional army, the Hittite state became utterly dependent on grain shipments from its fertile vassal territories hundreds of miles to the south, in places like the Syrian plains. This created a precarious lifeline, a supply chain of sustenance that stretched across vulnerable mountain passes. The Hittite king was constantly writing to his counterparts in Egypt, not just about gold and statues, but pleading for emergency shipments of grain during lean years. Their entire imperial structure, therefore, was a delicate balancing act. The central power in Hattusa was like a mighty oak tree with surprisingly shallow roots, its strength drawn from distant soil. As long as the rains fell in Syria and the trade routes remained secure, the empire could flourish. But what would happen if that lifeline was cut, or if the distant fields themselves failed? The meticulously filed tablets in Hattusa's archives held the blueprint for running an empire, but they could not command the clouds to rain or keep the roads open in a time of widespread crisis. The abandonment of their magnificent capital would be so total and so sudden that its location would be lost to history for over 3,000 years. Across the shimmering Aegean, the Mycenaean Greeks built a civilization of stone and story. Their world was centered on fortified palace complexes, perched on rocky hills like the legendary citadel of Mycenae, its entrance framed by the massive Lion Gate. These were not cities in the modern sense, but the command centers of a warrior aristocracy, places immortalized centuries later in the epic poems of Homer. Here, a powerful ruler, the Wanax, presided over a highly organized, almost bureaucratic economy. Scribes used a script called Linear B to keep meticulous records on clay tablets, inventorying everything from chariot wheels and bronze ingots to stores of olive oil and bolts of fine cloth. This was a redistributive economy, meaning all wealth flowed into the palace and was then doled out by the central administration. The palace controlled specialized workshops, large-scale farming, and trade across the Mediterranean. It was a system of remarkable efficiency, but also of profound fragility. Everything depended on the palace. If its authority cracked, the entire economic machine would seize up. The sheer scale of their fortifications tells its own story. The walls of Tiryns and Mycenae were built with such enormous, rough-hewn stones that later Greeks believed only the mythical Cyclopes could have lifted them. These cyclopean walls speak of a society that felt the need to look out from great heights, a culture perpetually aware of threats on the horizon. Their society was geared for war and wealth, for the glory of the hunt and the battlefield, a world of boar's tusk helmets and inlaid swords. Yet this concentration of power created a brittle structure. The regional farmers, herders, and artisans were not self-sufficient entrepreneurs. They were cogs in a palace-directed machine. When that machine finally stopped, the consequences were catastrophic. There was no alternative system to fall back on. The population, no longer supported by the central grain stores and trade networks, plummeted. People simply left, scattering to small, isolated villages. The knowledge of Linear B script, which existed only to serve the palace bureaucracy, vanished completely. Greece would enter a period often called a Dark Age, where the memory of the Mycenaean kings faded into myth, leaving behind only silent, giant walls and the echoing tales of a golden age of heroes. The collapse here was not just political, it was civilizational, erasing the very tools of record-keeping and complex organization for hundreds of years. But the story of collapse is not a single, uniform wave crashing over every shore. To the east, in the ancient land between the rivers, another power played by a different set of rules. The Middle Assyrian kingdom was a state forged in iron discipline and relentless ambition. While Egypt and Hittite exchanged polite, if tense, letters as brothers, the Assyrian kings projected a different image entirely. Their royal inscriptions are masterpieces of calculated intimidation, listing conquered cities and defeated enemies in grim, repetitive detail. Under a ruler like Tukulti-Ninurta I, Assyria was the aggressive newcomer at the great powers table, a kingdom constantly testing the limits of its neighbors. His most audacious move was the capture and brutal sack of the venerable city of Babylon itself, an act that shocked the diplomatic world. This was not the subtle maneuvering of the club of great powers. it was a raw display of military might that revealed the underlying volatility of the entire system. Assyria's strength was not in vast grain stores or a network of vassals, but in something more direct, a professional, highly organized army and a chokehold on commerce. Their heartland in northern Mesopotamia sat astride some of the most important overland trade routes in the ancient world, the vital arteries connecting the tin and copper sources of Anatolia with the riches of the Persian Gulf. Controlling these routes meant they could tax the lifeblood of the Bronze Age economy, even as they remained somewhat insulated from the sea, and this geographical position may have been their salvation. When the storms of collapse began to rage, first battering the coastal civilizations and severing maritime trade, Assyria found itself in a precarious but potentially survivable position. It was hurt, certainly. Its trade suffered, its ambitions were curtailed, and it entered a period of diminished power. Yet, unlike the total societal disintegration in Greece or the utter abandonment of Hattusa, the Assyrian state apparatus did not shatter. It contracted, it hunkered down, but it held. The core idea of Assyria, its identity as a centralized, militarized kingdom, survived the long, dark centuries. This endurance positioned it perfectly for a terrifying rebirth. From this diminished but coherent state would later erupt the Neo-Assyrian Empire, one of the most formidable military machines the world had ever seen. Assyria's story is a crucial clue in our mystery. It tells us the collapse was not an identical fate for all, but a filter. Some civilizations, built on more fragile foundations, were completely unmade. Others, though battered and reduced, retained the essential blueprint for power, waiting in the shadows for a new age to dawn. But the stability of the entire system relied on more than just military might or trade routes. In the sun-baked plains of southern Mesopotamia, where civilization itself was said to have begun, the Kassite rulers of Babylonia provided a different kind of glue. For over 4 centuries, they presided over the sacred heartland of Sumer and Akkad, the ancient cities of Ur and Nippur. Their great contribution was not conquest but continuity. They carefully maintained the intricate network of canals that fed life into the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and they became devoted custodians of Mesopotamian knowledge. In the quiet scriptoriums of Babylon, scholars preserved and copied the Epic of Gilgamesh, advanced mathematical and astronomical texts, and the vast omen literature that guided kings. This made Babylonia the intellectual and cultural anchor of the age, a steady, learned presence in the club of great powers. Their diplomatic letters show them constantly mediating, offering counsel, and exchanging lavish gifts like the famous Kassite blue glass, which was prized from Egypt to Anatolia. Yet this very stability masked a profound vulnerability. Babylon's wealth was not in fortifications or mines, but in the soil. Its entire existence was engineered, dependent on the precise management of those life-giving rivers. A series of poor floods, a shift in the river's course, or a prolonged drought could unravel the agricultural surplus that fed its people and funded its scholarship. The kingdom was a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering, but like all such systems, it was fragile, and when the wider world began to shudder, Babylonia's strength became a target. In the midst of the growing turbulence, its aggressive northern neighbor, Assyria, saw an opportunity. The Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta I, in a brutal breach of diplomatic norms, marched south and sacked the venerable city of Babylon itself. It was a shocking event, a violation of the very order the Kassites had helped uphold. The statues of Babylonian gods were carried off to Assyria, a deep spiritual and political humiliation. Yet here we see the strange resilience of a civilizational core. While the Kassite dynasty fell and imperial power fragmented, something crucial survived. The scribble schools, the agricultural techniques, the very language and stories of Mesopotamia did not vanish. They retreated into the local temples and cities, waiting. The sack of Babylon was a political catastrophe, but it was not a cultural extinction. This is a vital distinction in the story of collapse. It suggests that some foundations are so deeply laid that they can survive even the fall of the state that built upon them. The light in Babylon dimmed, but the flame of its knowledge was never fully extinguished. The walls of Medinet Habu tell a story of chaos. In a sprawling series of stone reliefs commissioned by Pharaoh Ramesses III, we see a world coming apart at the seams. The scenes show a desperate two-front war, with Egyptian chariots and infantry battling both on land and across the choppy waves of the Nile Delta. The enemies are depicted in a frantic, disordered mass, their families and belongings loaded onto ox carts, their ships upturned in the water. The Egyptian inscriptions give these invaders a collective, ominous name, the Sea Peoples. They list confederations with strange, unfamiliar names, the Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Denyon, and others. Ramesses III declares, in no uncertain terms, that he defeated these forces in a great, saving victory, repelling them from the borders of Egypt and preventing the kingdom's annihilation. His account presents them as the ultimate external threat, a storm of foreign aggression that he alone stood against. But this official story, carved in stone for eternity, is only the beginning of the mystery. Who exactly were the Sea Peoples? The truth is, we do not know for certain. They left no written records of their own, no king lists or victory steels. They exist only in the fearful records of the empires they attacked. Modern theories suggest they were not a single, unified nation, but a complex mix of displaced populations, opportunistic pirates, and warrior bands from regions already in turmoil, perhaps from the collapsing Mycenaean world, the coast of Anatolia, or the islands of the eastern Mediterranean. They were likely both a cause and a symptom of the wider collapse, a deadly feedback loop. Imagine a series of small, localized failures, a drought here, a rebellion there. This creates refugees, people pushed from their homes. These groups band together for survival, turning to raiding. Their successful raids disrupt trade and agriculture elsewhere, creating more refugees who then join the movement. The cycle accelerates. The Sea Peoples did not just fight armies, they targeted the very infrastructure of civilization. They sacked and burned coastal cities that were crucial hubs in the international trade network, ports through which flowed the tin, copper, ivory, and grain that sustained the great kingdoms. By severing these maritime lifelines, they acted like a surgeon cutting the major arteries of the Bronze Age world. The Hittite grain shipments from Syria could not get through. The Cypriot copper could not reach Greece. The delicate, just-in-time economy of prestige and necessity began to starve. So while Ramesses III may have won his battle and saved Egypt from immediate conquest, he could not save the system. The Sea Peoples were the spark, but the tinder had been piling up for generations, dry and ready to ignite. Yet the most formidable enemy may have had no army and carried no sword. While kings and generals watched the horizon for invaders, a far more insidious threat was creeping across the landscape itself. Recent science has uncovered a chilling truth. The very climate that nurtured these civilizations began to betray them. By studying the growth rings of ancient trees in Anatolia and analyzing layers of mud from the bottom of the Dead Sea, researchers have pieced together a stark picture. Around the year 1200 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean was gripped by a severe, prolonged drought that may have lasted for generations. This was not a single bad harvest. It was a relentless, decades-long shift that slowly parched the land. For societies built entirely on agricultural abundance, this was a silent, existential crisis. Imagine the lifeblood of an empire slowly draining away. In Egypt, the Nile's annual flood, that sacred, predictable event, became less reliable. The fields that fed millions received less of the rich, black silt, and the harvests began to shrink. In the Hittite Empire, the situation was even more dire. their already precarious grain shipments from the south would have dwindled to a trickle as the Syrian breadbasket itself dried up. Famine is not just a shortage of food, it is a social earthquake. It starts with rising prices and hungry children, then grows into the movement of desperate people abandoning their ancestral villages in search of sustenance. These climate refugees would have swelled the roads, putting immense strain on neighboring regions and creating friction wherever they went. A kingdom struggling to feed its own people cannot also maintain a large professional army. Soldiers must be paid, often in grain, and a hungry soldier is a soldier who deserts or turns to banditry. The very tax base of the state, which came from agricultural surplus, evaporates. This meant palaces could no longer afford to fund their bureaucracies, their artisans, or their far-flung trade missions. The intricate system of gift exchange and diplomatic obligation that held the club of great powers together relied on a steady flow of luxury goods and staple foods. When that flow stopped, the alliances began to fray. Kings who once called each other brother now had nothing to send, and every shipment of grain became a matter of survival, not diplomacy. The drought did not cause the collapse by itself, but it was the ultimate stress test, applying unbearable pressure to every crack in the system. It turned manageable challenges into existential threats, transformed loyal farmers into restless migrants, and made the once unthinkable idea of abandoning a great capital like Hattusa a grim necessity. The invaders from the sea may have delivered the final blows, but it was the failing rains and the dust-blown fields that brought these mighty empires to their knees. The mightiest walls cannot protect a kingdom from the anger of its own people. Beyond the invading armies and the failing rains, there lies another suspect in our mystery, one that strikes at the very heart of how these empires were organized. The glittering palaces and vast granaries were monuments to a system of profound inequality. This was a world built on a rigid, top-heavy economy where wealth and decision-making were concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite, the king, his family, high priests, and a small class of administrators. Everyone else, the farmers who grew the grain, the artisans who crafted the goods, and the soldiers who defended the borders, existed to support that central power. They paid heavy taxes, often in the form of their labor or a portion of their harvest, and in return, the palace provided security and distributed necessities. It was a fragile social contract. For generations, as long as the harvests were plentiful and trade flowed, the system held. The average person might have grumbled, but life was predictable. But what happens when that predictability vanishes? When a prolonged drought means a farmer's taxes take not just his surplus, but the food his family needs to survive. When trade collapses and the palace can no longer supply the bronze to fix his plow or the cloth it promised, the contract shatters. In such a moment, the Grand Palace is no longer a source of protection and order. It transforms into a symbol of extraction and failure. Historians note that in several regions, there is little archaeological evidence of a prolonged siege or a great destructive battle at the sites of major palaces. Instead, there are signs of gradual depopulation and then abandonment. This suggests a different kind of ending, not a dramatic conquest, but a slow unraveling. The farmers, the lifeblood of the state, may have simply walked away. They returned to simpler, subsistence living in scattered hilltop villages, turning their backs on the kings and the tax collectors. Lower-level soldiers, who are often paid in rations from those same granaries, would have faced a stark choice: stay loyal to a failing state that could not feed them, or desert, perhaps even joining the bands of raiders and refugees already on the move. This theory of internal revolt paints the collapse not as a murder, but as a societal collapse from within. The empires, hollowed out by generations of mismanagement and extreme centralization, became brittle. When the climate crisis and the raids from the sea applied immense pressure, they did not bend, they shattered under their own weight. the people who were meant to be the foundation of the kingdom's strength became, in its final hour, the source of its fatal weakness. It is a timeless cautionary tale about the invisible foundations of power, reminding us that the loyalty of the many is the only true defense a civilization ever has. That intricate web of trade was the civilization's silent, beating heart. Think of a single bronze sword gleaming in the hands of a Mycenaean warrior or a Hittite general. To create it, copper from the mines of Cyprus had to be smelted and shipped across the sea. Then, from a source over 3,000 miles to the east, perhaps in the distant mountains of Afghanistan, came the crucial ingredient, tin. These two metals would travel along separate, perilous routes, by donkey caravan through hostile mountain passes, and by fragile wooden ships navigating pirate-haunted coasts, only to meet finally in a workshop in Greece or Anatolia. The entire prestige, military power, and very functionality of these kingdoms relied on this staggering logistical feat. It was a just-in-time economy spanning continents, and it worked beautifully until it didn't. The first domino to fall was likely security, as drought-induced famine sparked internal unrest and displaced populations took to the seas as raiders. Those vital shipping lanes became untenable. A merchant vessel carrying ingots of Cypriot copper was no longer just a cargo ship. It became a floating treasure chest for the desperate and the opportunistic. Port cities, the essential hubs where goods were transferred from sea to land routes, became prime targets for the groups we call the Sea Peoples. One by one, these cosmopolitan centers were sacked, burned, and abandoned. With each port that fell, another link in the chain was severed. Suddenly, the tin from the east could not reach the Mediterranean. The copper from Cyprus could not reach mainland Greece. The system began to starve. Inside the palaces, the consequences were immediate and paralyzing. The royal workshops, which employed specialized smiths, jewelers, and armorers, fell silent. Without raw materials, there was nothing to craft. The artisans, who were often paid from the palace granaries, found themselves without work and then without food. But the crisis went far deeper than unemployment. Bronze was not just a metal, it was the currency of power and ritual. Kings demonstrated their divine right to rule through magnificent bronze offerings to the gods. Elite warriors defined their status through ornate bronze armor and weapons. The entire military edge of an empire, from chariot fittings to spear points, depended on a steady supply. When the bronze stopped flowing, the elite lost more than luxury. They lost the very tools that enforced their authority and defended their borders. A king who could not arm his troops was a king who could not project power, either to put down internal rebellions or to repel external invaders. This economic fragmentation created a vicious, accelerating cycle. As the Hittite Empire faltered, its collapse severed the overland routes from the east even further. As Mycenaean Greece disintegrated, its ships vanished from the sea lanes, making trade for anyone else even more dangerous. Each kingdom's struggle amplified the struggles of its neighbors, transforming a series of regional disasters into a single, catastrophic systemic failure. They had built a world of dazzling interconnection, but they had forgotten to build a world that could survive its own connections breaking. In the end, their greatest strength, that global network of exchange, became their most devastating weakness, leaving behind a silent landscape where the only remaining bronze was already in the hands of the dead. The ground itself holds the final, undeniable testimony. In layer after layer, from the coast of Syria to the highlands of Turkey and the rocky shores of Greece, archaeologists brush away the dust to find the same stark story written in soil and stone. It is called a destruction horizon, a single, thin line of charcoal and shattered pottery that marks a moment when the world changed forever. At the bustling port city of Ugarit, a vital link in the trade network, the evidence is particularly haunting. Excavators discovered a clay tablet in a kiln, hardened by the very fire that consumed the city. It was a desperate message from the king, a last-minute plea for help to a neighboring ally, stating that enemy ships had been sighted. The letter was never sent. The city was put to the torch, its wealth looted, and its streets were never rebuilt as a major center. This was not a slow fading, it was a sudden, violent end. High in the mountains of Anatolia, the story at Hattusa is different but just as telling. There is no vast layer of ash from a great conflagration. Instead, the grand capital of the Hittite Empire shows signs of a deliberate, orderly abandonment. The massive gates in the Cyclopean walls were left open. The royal archives were carefully hidden in sealed rooms, perhaps with a faint hope of return. But no one ever came back to read those tablets again. The city was left to the wind and the wolves for centuries. In Greece, at the palace of Pylos, the home of the legendary King Nestor, fire swept through the complex. The intense heat was so great it baked and preserved the very linear B tablets that recorded the palace's final days, a cruel irony that saved the receipts of a dying civilization. This pattern is what makes the Bronze Age collapse so compelling and so eerie to researchers. From Megiddo in the Levant to Miletus on the coast of Anatolia, the archaeological record sings the same sad chorus within a span of just 50 years. A thriving urban center, a layer of violent destruction, and then a profound silence that lasts for centuries. This uniformity across thousands of miles is one of the strongest clues we have. It tells us this was not a series of isolated, unrelated tragedies. It was a wave, a storm system of catastrophe that moved across the entire region, leaving no major kingdom untouched. Whether it was the same armies marching from one city to the next, or a cascade of failures that ignited like a chain of fireworks, the result was a synchronized unraveling of the known world. The ashes of Ugarit, the silent gates of Hattusa, and the scorched tablets of Pylos are not just ruins. They are the fossilized heartbeat of an age, stopping abruptly in the archaeological record. These desperate voices were not lost to the silence of ruins. They were baked into clay, preserved by the very fires that consumed their world. Across the smoldering remains of palaces, archaeologists have recovered the last frantic messages of kings and officials, written in the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform and the elegant symbols of hieroglyphs. These texts are our direct line to the final moments, transforming the collapse from an abstract historical event into a raw human drama. To understand the shift, we must listen to two very different conversations. First, the Amarna letters, a diplomatic archive from Egypt's peak in the 14th century BCE. Here, the language is one of polished etiquette and calibrated complaint. Kings address each other as brother, exchanging lavish gifts and negotiating marriages. A Babylonian ruler gently chides the pharaoh for sending low-quality gold, while a Hittite king negotiates the terms of a peace treaty. The tone is confident, the world stable and governed by rules. Fast forward a century and the correspondence changes utterly. The letters found at Ugarit, a major port city, are cries of alarm. One tablet, sent as the city burned, reads, "Father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." The message ends with a plea. Does my father not know that all my troops are stationed in Hattusa, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? They have not arrived back, so the country is abandoned. This is not diplomacy, it is a scream into a void. Perhaps the most poignant fragment comes from the king of Elashia, ancient Cyprus, the island that was a primary source of copper. In a letter to the pharaoh, he apologizes for sending a shipment of only 500 units of the precious metal, a paltry amount. His explanation is heartbreakingly simple: the enemy is in my land. He writes that his own cities have been burned and he is powerless. Even the victors tell a story of profound disruption. An inscription of Pharaoh Merneptah, who reigned just before the worst of the crisis, states, "The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray." This official boast inadvertently reveals a terrifying new reality: coordinated attacks emerging from the sea, from places the centralized empires could not see or control. These fragments are the last radio transmissions from a sinking ship, crackling with static and panic. They show us a world where communications are being severed, where allies cannot be reached, and where the old rules of brotherhood and obligation mean nothing. A king in Cyprus cannot send copper because his mines are under attack. A king in Ugarit has sent all his forces to aid his Hittite overlord, leaving his own homeland defenseless. The system of mutual defense has collapsed, and each kingdom is left isolated, waiting for help that will never come. This written record provides the human dimension to the ash layers and shattered pottery, giving voice to the fear, confusion, and desperate hope of the people who lived through the unthinkable end of their age. The identity of the Sea Peoples remains the central enigma of the entire collapse. Who were these shadowy figures blamed for bringing down an age? The Egyptian carvings show a chaotic mix of warriors and families, but they offer no clear homeland. Were they a single, coordinated army on a mission of conquest, or something far more complex, a desperate mosaic of many different peoples? Unraveling this mystery is crucial, because the answer changes the very nature of the catastrophe. If they were a unified invading force, then the story is one of conquest. But if they were something else, the narrative becomes infinitely more tragic, a story of dominoes falling, where the attackers were often themselves refugees from earlier disasters. Some clues point to familiar places already in turmoil. Certain names listed by the Egyptians, like the Denyen, sound remarkably similar to the Danaoi, Homer's name for the Mycenaean Greeks. Could some of these sea peoples have been displaced warriors and sailors from the collapsing palace kingdoms of Greece, their homes burned and their way of life extinct, now taking to the sea in search of new lands? Other groups, like the Shekelesh, may have originated from Sicily, while the Lucca are linked to the coast of Anatolia, a region under tremendous stress from drought and Hittite collapse. This theory paints them not as a mysterious foreign horde, but as a collection of peoples from the very edges of the failing system, now set adrift. Another compelling idea suggests they were not a nation at all, but a profession. In this view, the Sea Peoples began as a mix of freelance mercenaries and pirates, soldiers for hire who had long served in the armies of the great kingdoms. When those empires could no longer pay them, these highly trained, heavily armed bands turned on their former employers. They would have known the trade routes, the weaknesses of port cities, and the tactics of the very armies they once fought beside. This turns them from an external mystery into an internal symptom, a sign that the professional military class had broken free from the crumbling states that created them. Perhaps the most complete explanation is a synthesis of all these ideas. Imagine a prolonged drought pushing entire communities off their ancestral lands in Anatolia and the Aegean. These climate refugees would have swelled the ranks of the displaced. Among them were former soldiers, now unemployed and desperate, and opportunistic pirates drawn to the chaos. These groups would have coalesced into mobile, multi-ethnic bands, not with a grand plan of empire, but with the simple, brutal goal of survival. They moved along the coasts because the seas were highways, and they attacked rich cities because those cities held the food and supplies they needed to live. Their violence was not a cause, but a consequence, a furious reaction to a world that was already coming apart. In this light, the Sea Peoples are both perpetrator and victim, a symbol of the collapse's terrifying chain reaction. One of their confederations, however, left a permanent mark that helps us trace their legacy. The Peliset, so prominently named in Ramesses III's inscriptions, are widely accepted by scholars as the Philistines of biblical tradition. After their confrontations with Egypt, they settled on the southern coast of Canaan, in a region that still bears their name, Palestine. Archaeology shows their distinct material culture, featuring pottery styles reminiscent of the Aegean world and a diet that included pork, setting them apart from their Canaanite neighbors. Their story embodies the full cycle, from being labeled a destructive force of chaos to becoming settled farmers and city dwellers, eventually integrated into the fabric of a new age. This transformation is a powerful clue. It suggests that for many of these so-called invaders, conquest was never the ultimate goal, settlement was. They were not just bringers of the Dark Age, they were also among the first to begin building what would come after. Beyond the human conflicts and failing harvests, the very ground beneath their feet may have begun to rebel. The Eastern Mediterranean is a geologically restless place, a mosaic of tectonic plates that grind and shudder against one another. Major fault lines run like scars beneath the glittering coasts of Anatolia and the islands of the Aegean, regions that were the very heart of the Bronze Age world. What if, in the midst of all their other crises, the Earth itself delivered a series of catastrophic blows? At several key archaeological sites, excavators have uncovered a particular kind of destruction that hints at a force beyond human armies. Walls are found collapsed in a specific inward direction, as if shaken from their foundations. Massive stone blocks are displaced not by the battering ram, but by a sudden, violent tremor. At the Mycenaean palace of Turin, for instance, there is evidence that its mighty walls were damaged and then hastily repaired just before the site's final abandonment. This suggests a society already on the brink, desperately trying to patch its physical defenses after a natural disaster. A single, powerful earthquake could devastate a city, but the theory proposes something far more terrifying: a seismic storm. Imagine a period of increased tectonic activity, where major quakes ripple across the region over a span of decades. For civilizations already starved by drought and fractured by social unrest, such events would be catastrophic multipliers of chaos. A quake does not just topple buildings, it shatters the intricate infrastructure of civilization. It collapses the granaries that hold the last reserves of food. It ruptures the vital aqueducts and cisterns, cutting off water supplies to thirsty populations. It reduces defensive walls to rubble, leaving cities naked and exposed to any raider or rival. The psychological impact would be equally devastating. In a world where the stability of the king and the favor of the gods were intertwined, a series of such disasters would be seen as divine abandonment. If the earth, the very foundation of existence, was rejecting them, what hope could remain? This geological theory, however, comes with a significant challenge for historians. The archaeological signature of a city destroyed by warfare and fire can look remarkably similar to one leveled by an earthquake. An invading army burns palaces which collapse. A quake topples buildings which are then set ablaze by overturned hearths and oil lamps. Disentangling the two causes 3,000 years later is incredibly difficult. So while evidence of seismic activity exists, it is rarely the sole culprit uncovered at a site. This leads most researchers to see earthquakes not as the single cause of the collapse, but as the ultimate tipping point. Think of a society already weakened by famine, its trade networks severed, and its people losing faith in their leaders. It is holding on, but just barely. Then the ground heaves. In that moment, the last threads of order snap. The king cannot command the fault lines. The priest's prayers cannot steady the trembling earth. What remained of centralized authority, of communal will to rebuild, likely evaporated. The earthquake theory forces us to remember that human history is not a separate story from the planet's own dramatic narrative. Our grandest empires are temporary structures built on a restless, living geology. The Bronze Age kingdoms, for all their sophistication, were ultimately guests on a volatile landscape. A convergence of seismic shocks across that landscape would have been a final, undeniable message. A reminder that the forces which nurture civilization can, without warning, reclaim everything they have given. The silence that followed the burning palaces was not just one of people, but of words themselves. In the ashes of the Mycenaean world, something extraordinary and chilling happened. The linear B script, the precise administrative tool used to tally chariots and olive oil stores, simply ceased to exist. No one wrote it, read it, or taught it to their children ever again. For Greece, the lights did not just go out. The very ability to record and transmit complex information was extinguished. This plunge into a centuries-long dark age without writing represents one of the most profound losses in human history. It was more than an administrative failure. It was a rupture in cultural memory, a severing of the thread that connects one generation's accumulated wisdom to the next. Across the sea in Anatolia, a similar fate befell the Hittite cuneiform tradition. Their vast archives of treaties, laws, and rituals were carefully hidden, then utterly forgotten. The intricate knowledge of how to press those wedge-shaped signs into clay died with the empire that nurtured it. Yet this story of loss is not universal, and that contrast holds a vital clue. In the ancient heartlands of Mesopotamia and along the enduring Nile, literacy did not vanish. The cuneiform of the Babylonian scribes and the hieroglyphs of the Egyptian temples continued, passed down through generations, even as the political powers around them rose and fell. So why did some writing systems perish completely while others survived the storm? The answer lies not in the quality of the script itself, but in the depth of the institutional collapse that supported it. In Mycenaean Greece and the Hittite Empire, literacy was a specialized, elite skill tightly bound to the palace bureaucracy. The scribe was not a free scholar in a marketplace of ideas. He was a civil servant, his entire purpose tied to recording the wealth and commands of the central authority. When that palace was burned and abandoned, when the king and his administrators were gone, the scribe's profession lost all meaning and economic support. There was no one left to pay him, no tablets left to inscribe, and no audience left to read them. The knowledge, confined to such a narrow class, evaporated like water in a shattered vase. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, however, writing had sunk deeper roots. It was not solely the property of the royal court. In Mesopotamia, scribble schools were often attached to temples, institutions that held spiritual and economic power independent of whichever king currently ruled. The temple, as a center of landholding and ritual, needed its own records and preserved its own traditions. In Egypt, hieroglyphs were sacred, carved into stone for eternity, part of the very fabric of religious and state identity. While the scale and splendor of inscription diminished in hard times, the knowledge of how to read and write was maintained within these more resilient, culturally embedded institutions. The loss of literacy in Greece and Anatolia, therefore, is a direct measure of the totality of their collapse. It tells us that their entire social order was not just damaged, but unmade at a foundational level. The silence that followed was so complete that when writing finally returned to Greece centuries later, it was a new, borrowed alphabet, and the memory of the Mycenaean age had faded into the mists of Homeric epic. This stark difference reminds us that the survival of ideas depends not just on their brilliance, but on the strength and diversity of the vessels that carry them forward. The pharaoh's victory at Medinet Habu saved Egypt from conquest, but it could not save the kingdom from decline. While Egypt is often remembered as the sole survivor of the Bronze Age collapse, this survival came at a staggering cost, a victory so draining it nearly broke the state that achieved it. The new kingdom emerged from the crisis not as a triumphant superpower, but as an exhausted and deeply wounded giant. For decades, the royal treasury had been poured into a relentless two-front war, funding the campaigns against the mysterious sea peoples in the delta and against persistent Libyan incursions from the west. Every shipment of gold, every cache of grain, every conscripted soldier was a resource diverted from maintaining the empire itself. The cost was not just measured in wealth, but in the very authority of the pharaoh. To pay for these endless defenses, the crown was forced to grant vast tracts of land and power to the great temples and to provincial governors. These local powers grew strong, while the central authority in the capital of Pyramises slowly weakened. The pharaoh, once an invincible god-king whose word commanded the two lands, now had to negotiate with his own subjects. The consequences of this slow bleed of power became undeniable in the decades that followed. One by one, the hard-won imperial possessions slipped away. The wealthy provinces in Canaan, the source of tribute and strategic depth, were lost, their Egyptian garrisons withdrawn or overrun. To the south, the lucrative gold mines of Nubia, the economic engine of the empire, fell out of pharaonic control. Finally, the unthinkable happened. The country itself split in two, with rival power bases forming in the north and south, plunging Egypt into a long period of political fragmentation. The brilliant, unified civilization of the new kingdom was gone. What remained was a still proud culture, a continuous line of pharaohs, and an unbroken tradition of writing and religion. But the imperial glory and vast economic reach of the Ramesside era were never recovered. Egypt's story in the aftermath is perhaps the most telling of all. It demonstrates that even the most resilient, geographically blessed civilization could be permanently diminished by the cascade of failures. Survival did not mean bouncing back. It meant entering a long, quiet chapter of introspection, where the memory of a lost golden age would haunt a land now focused on preserving what it had left, rather than conquering what lay beyond. But from the scorched earth and silent ports, a new kind of power began to stir. While the great empires turned inward or crumbled, a remarkable transformation was unfolding along the narrow coastal strip of the Levant. Here, from the ashes of burned cities like Ugarit, the survivors were not just rebuilding, they were reinventing the very rules of civilization. These were the Phoenicians, and their story is not one of mere endurance but of brilliant adaptation. With the Hittite and Egyptian overseers now gone, the old Canaanite city-states of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos found themselves suddenly free. The collapse of the great powers had, paradoxically, shattered the ceiling above them. No longer vassals required to send their wealth to distant imperial capitals. These coastal cities looked out at the empty sea and saw not a barrier, but a highway to a new future. They became the ultimate opportunists of the wreckage, pivoting from being cogs in a land-based empire to becoming masters of the maritime world. Their genius was practical and profound. First, they looked at the terrifying, pirate-infested waters that had helped doom the Bronze Age and decided to conquer them. They developed the most advanced shipbuilding technology of the age, constructing sturdy, deep-hulled vessels capable of long, open-water voyages far beyond the sight of land. These were not the galleys of raiders, but the freighters of merchants designed to carry bulk goods. With these ships, the Phoenicians did something no Bronze Age empire had ever managed. They established a stable, far-flung network of trade colonies and ports that stretched across the entire Mediterranean. From their home ports, they sailed westward, founding outposts on Cyprus, in North Africa at Carthage, on Sicily, Sardinia, and even pushing through the Strait of Gibraltar to reach the Atlantic coasts of Spain and Morocco. They were searching for resources, and they found them: silver in Spain, tin in Cornwall, and the precious purple dye from murex snails that gave them their name. This was not the centralized, palace-controlled trade of the old era. It was a decentralized, entrepreneurial web, and it made cities like Tyre immensely wealthy and powerful. Perhaps their most enduring innovation, however, was born from a need for efficiency in this new commercial world. The old writing systems of the Bronze Age, the complex cuneiform of Mesopotamia, and the hieroglyphs of Egypt required years of training. They were tools for priests and royal scribes. The Phoenicians, bustling merchants who needed to keep contracts, label cargo, and send quick communications, had no time for that. So they simplified. They took the basic idea of Egyptian hieroglyphs and stripped it down to its purest form, a set of about 24 symbols, each representing a single consonant sound. This was the birth of the first true alphabet. It was a revolutionary piece of technology democratizing literacy. Now, a trader could learn to read and write in a matter of weeks, not a lifetime. This simple, portable system of marks could record any spoken language. As the Phoenician ships sailed, their alphabet traveled with them, a tool more valuable than any cargo. The Greeks would later adopt and adapt it, adding vowels, and from there it would become the foundation of the Latin script used across the Western world today. The Phoenicians, in their relentless practicality, had accidentally forged the primary tool of global communication for millennia to come. Their rise is a powerful lesson in the strange opportunities that follow catastrophe. The Bronze Age collapse did not create the Phoenicians, but it created the vacuum in which they could thrive. They stepped into the spaces left by fallen giants, not as conquerors seeking to rebuild empires, but as connectors building a new kind of network. They exemplify how collapse can clear the ground for radical innovation, transforming former subjects into pioneers. In the grand narrative of collapse and dark age, the Phoenician cities shine as beacons, proving that the end of one world is often just the chaotic beginning of another. The grand corridors of Mycenae fell silent, and for hundreds of years no one wrote their story down. In Greece and Anatolia, the world shrank dramatically after the fires of collapse cooled. The bustling international ports, the chariot-filled roads, and the great archive halls were all gone. What remained was a landscape of profound quiet and startling simplicity. The population plummeted, with estimates suggesting a drop of as much as 90% in some areas. People retreated from the vulnerable plains and coastlines, clustering in small, isolated hilltop villages for safety. The intricate web of long-distance trade that had defined the Bronze Age was severed, and communities turned inward, relying only on what they could produce within sight of their own homes. This shift is visible in the very objects they left behind. The beautiful, naturalistic pottery of the Mycenaean palaces, decorated with octopuses and chariot processions, disappeared. In its place came a new style, stark and simple, adorned only with basic geometric shapes, lines, and circles. This was not a decline in skill, but a change in need and meaning. Without a palace commissioning fine wares for export or elite ceremony, pottery became purely functional, made for local use. The technological sophistication of the previous age faded too. The knowledge of how to construct Tholos tombs, how to inlay bronze with gold, or how to mix the mortar for cyclopean walls was gradually forgotten. It was a return to essentials, a societal simplification on a scale we can scarcely comprehend. For a long time, historians looked at this period and saw only loss, labeling it a dark age, a blank page between chapters of civilization. But modern archaeology has begun to redraw that picture. This era was not merely an empty void, it was a necessary reset. The collapse shattered the rigid, top-heavy hierarchies of the palace system. The all-powerful wanaks, the specialized scribe, the court artisan, these roles vanished with the institutions that created them. In their place, a new social order began to form, one built from the ground up. Power became more local and more personal, likely vested in village elders and warrior heads of families. This was a world where leadership had to be earned and consensus mattered, because no distant king was coming to impose order or provide supplies. This long period of localism and simplification created the fertile ground for something entirely new. The small, self-reliant villages of the Greek world slowly began to grow and interact again. Over centuries, they started to coalesce into larger communities, not around a palace, but around a shared public space, an agora, and a fortified high point, an acropolis. These were the seeds of the classical Greek polis, the independent city-state. The values forged in the long quiet, self-reliance, community debate, and a deep connection to a specific place would become the bedrock of Athenian democracy and Spartan militarism alike. The collapse did not destroy the future, it cleared the overgrown forest of empire, allowing new and hardier political saplings to take root. The grandeur was gone, but in its absence, a more resilient and ultimately revolutionary form of society was quietly, slowly being born. While the Phoenicians looked to the sea, another profound transformation was taking root in the inland hills. The retreat of the Egyptian and Hittite superpowers from the Levant left a political landscape suddenly open, a vacuum where new identities could form. For centuries, this land bridge between continents had been a contested border zone, its cities and peoples subject to the demands and taxes of distant imperial capitals. With those capitals now silent or preoccupied, the old rules dissolved. Into this space stepped smaller, tribal communities who had long inhabited the rugged central highlands, away from the vulnerable coastal plains. Free from the heavy hand of imperial administration, these groups began a slow process of coalescence, forging shared bonds and a common story. From this crucible of collapse emerged the earliest foundations of the Hebrew kingdoms, Israel and Judah. The biblical narratives that tell of conquest, judges, and kings were composed centuries after these events, layered with profound theological meaning and national identity. Yet scholars note that within these epic stories, there may echo distant, fragmented memories of this very period of upheaval. The tales of arriving in a land, of struggling against the remnants of the weakened Canaanite city-states, and of gradually settling the hill country, align with the archaeological picture of a time when large-scale imperial control vanished. It was an era when local chieftains could become kings, when tribal alliances could solidify into a nation, precisely because there was no pharaoh or Hittite emperor to say otherwise. The rise of a centralized monarchy under figures like David and Solomon, whether fully historical or partly legendary, represents a political innovation made possible by the shattered old order. This was more than just a change in governance, it was the birth of a revolutionary idea. The struggles, reflections, and experiences of these new kingdoms in the shadow of collapse eventually crystallized into a unique monotheistic tradition. Their foundational texts grappled deeply with themes of covenant, social justice, and divine purpose concepts forged in the furnace of surviving catastrophe and building a society from the ground up. The enduring legacy of this tradition, which would give rise to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is almost unimaginable without the prior crumbling of the Bronze Age world. The collapse did not create these faiths, but it created the fractured, open landscape in which a small group of people could ask the biggest questions and arrive at answers that would eventually circle the globe. In this way, the end of 5 empires indirectly set the stage for spiritual ideas that would outlast empires for millennia. The scarcity of bronze forced a fundamental rethinking of what power was made of. With the tin trade route severed and the great smelting workshops silent, the gleaming alloy that had defined kings and gods for centuries was suddenly beyond reach. In its absence, societies turned to a metal they had long known but largely ignored for fine work, iron. This was not a smooth upgrade, it was a difficult, messy revolution born of sheer desperation. Iron ore is actually more common than copper or tin, found in rocky deposits across much of the Mediterranean world, but unlocking its potential is a far more demanding process. To make bronze, you simply melt copper and tin together. To make usable iron, you must smelt the ore at extremely high temperatures to remove impurities, then repeatedly heat and hammer the resulting bloom to beat out the slag, a labor-intensive technique called forging. The resulting metal was often inferior to the best bronze at first, more prone to rust and harder to shape into elegant forms. So why did they bother? Because necessity is the mother of invention, and the collapse had created a profound necessity. When you can no longer import the ingredients for bronze, you turn to what you have under your own feet. This shift from bronze to iron changed the very geography of power. Bronze production had been a centralized, elite activity. It required controlling long-distance supply chains and maintaining specialized workshops attached to palaces. Iron production, by contrast, could be local. A village with a source of ore, a simple furnace, and a skilled blacksmith could produce its own tools and weapons. This technological shift democratized metal in a way that was unimaginable in the Bronze Age. It meant that authority was no longer solely vested in whoever controlled the distant tin mines. A local chieftain could now arm his followers without permission from a faraway king. The iron plowshare, tougher and more effective than its bronze counterpart, allowed farmers to cut deeper into harder soils, opening up new land for cultivation away from the vulnerable river valleys. The iron axe cleared forests more efficiently, providing more farmland and building material. This technological leap directly supported the more decentralized, village-based world that was emerging from the ashes. The new metal also reshaped the nature of conflict. Iron weapons were cheaper and more widely available than bronze ones. This did not necessarily make armies larger, but it changed who could fight and how. Warfare became less the exclusive domain of an aristocratic chariot-owning class and more accessible to larger groups of infantry. The iconic weapon of the coming age would not be the ornate bronze rapier of a Mycenaean lord, but the sturdy iron spear of a citizen soldier. The Iron Age, forged in the crisis of the collapse, was inherently a more fragmented, localized, and in some ways more resilient era. Power was dispersed. The age of the monolithic, resource-hungry superpower was, for a time, over. This profound technological shift reminds us that collapse is not an end, but a violent catalyst. When the old ways break, innovation is no longer a luxury. It is the only path to survival, and the tools we create in that struggle will inevitably shape the world we rebuild. The echoes of that ancient collapse are not locked in the distant past. They resonate with a startling clarity in our own hyper-connected world. The sophisticated network of the Bronze Age, that club of great powers, has a direct descendant today, our own global civilization. We live in an era defined by interdependence, by digital threads that connect financial markets in seconds and supply chains that stretch across oceans. Our prosperity, much like theirs, is built on a foundation of constant, seamless exchange. We rely on components from one continent, assembly in another, and distribution across a third. It is a system of incredible efficiency and breathtaking fragility. The collapse of the late Bronze Age stands as history's most profound case study in systemic risk, a warning written in clay and ash about what happens when connectivity outpaces resilience. Their vulnerability was the tin trade, a single point of failure for an entire age. Ours might be a rare earth mineral, a vital shipping lane, or the stability of a digital network. The principle is identical. When everything is linked, a shock in one place becomes a tremor felt everywhere. We have witnessed this in recent memory. A health challenge in one region can halt global travel and disrupt manufacturing worldwide. A conflict far away can send energy prices soaring on every continent. A blockage in a single, narrow waterway can delay the delivery of everything from electronics to furniture. These are not isolated incidents, they are symptoms of the same ancient condition, a civilization whose strength is also its greatest weakness. The lesson of the collapse is not that we should retreat from global connection. That is neither possible nor desirable. The lesson is about the quality of that connection. The Bronze Age kingdoms built a network without a backup plan. When the ships stopped sailing, they had no alternative. Our task, informed by their story, is to build smarter systems, ones with redundancy and flexibility. It means diversifying supply sources, investing in local capacity, and designing economies that can adapt to sudden disruption. It is a lesson in humility, reminding us that no civilization, no matter how advanced, is immune to the cascading consequences of a broken link. By studying how they fell, we gain not a prophecy of doom, but a manual for vigilance. Their story urges us to look at the intricate web we have woven and ask ourselves a simple, vital question: where are our single points of failure, and what are we doing to reinforce them? The true horror of the collapse lies not in a single villain, but in the terrifying synergy of many. Modern historians have largely moved away from searching for a lone cause, a silver bullet that killed the Bronze Age. Instead, they see a grim convergence, what we might call a perfect storm. Picture a complex, interlocked system humming with activity. Now imagine applying not one, but 4 or 5 different pressures to it at the same time. A prolonged drought parches the farmland, weakening the entire agricultural base. Major earthquakes shudder through the region, toppling city walls and granaries. Inside the kingdoms, the social contract frays as people grow weary of supporting a lavish elite while their own children go hungry. Then, the vital trade routes snap, cutting off the supply of bronze, the very material of power and ritual. Each of these stresses alone would have been a severe crisis, a test of resilience. But together, they created a feedback loop of catastrophe. The drought created refugees who put pressure on new lands and sometimes turned to raiding. Those raids disrupted trade further, which made it harder for kings to pay their soldiers or feed their people, which fueled more internal discontent. The earthquakes didn't just destroy buildings, they shattered the last vestiges of confidence and order. Into this maelstrom sailed the groups we call the Sea Peoples. They were likely not a unified foreign army, but a chaotic mix of displaced peoples, desperate migrants, and opportunistic warriors from regions already unraveling. They were as much a product of the collapse as a cause of it. Their attacks on port cities and coastal settlements were the final, decisive trigger. They delivered the coup de grace to empires that were already bleeding out from a dozen internal wounds. A kingdom struggling with famine could perhaps repel an invader. A kingdom recovering from an earthquake might manage a poor harvest, but a kingdom facing famine, earthquake, rebellion, and economic collapse all at once has no resources left when the ships appear on the horizon. This is the system's collapse model. It teaches us that civilizations are not destroyed by isolated events, but by cascading failures where each new problem magnifies the last. The Bronze Age world did not have a heart attack, it suffered multiple organ failure. Its interconnectedness, once its greatest strength, became the channel through which every local disaster became a global crisis. The collapse was unstoppable not because of the power of any one enemy, but because the entire foundation of the age was being pulled apart in too many places at the same time. The ground is still giving up its secrets. For all we have pieced together, the Bronze Age collapse remains a dynamic puzzle, its final picture still shifting with every new discovery. This is not a mystery locked away in old textbooks, but a vibrant, ongoing investigation, a cold case from antiquity that continues to challenge some of the brightest minds in archaeology and science. The questions that remain are as compelling as the answers we have found. Take the legendary city of Troy. Archaeologists have long debated which of its many layers corresponds to the Troy of Homeric epic. The layer known as Troy 7 shows clear signs of violent destruction and fire from around the right time period. But was this a casualty of the wider collapse or the result of a more localized conflict? The evidence is tantalizing but inconclusive, a single thread in a much larger tapestry of ruin that we are still trying to weave together. New scientific tools are allowing us to ask questions the ancient scribes could never have imagined. Researchers can now perform isotopic analysis on ancient teeth. This means by studying the chemical signatures locked in the enamel of a 3,000-year-old skeleton, they can determine where that individual grew up and even trace their migrations. Imagine applying this to remains found in a destroyed coastal city. Were they locals defending their homes, or were they people from hundreds of miles away? This technology could finally help us understand the true origins and movements of the enigmatic sea peoples, moving us from educated guesses toward hard evidence. Similarly, advances in climate science are providing higher resolution data. By studying sediment cores from lake beds and stalagmites from caves with incredible precision, scientists are building a year-by-year picture of ancient droughts, refining our understanding of just how long and how severe the dry period really was, and how it correlated precisely with the fall of specific cities. Even the Nile, that timeless symbol of permanence, is under new scrutiny. Scholars are meticulously examining ancient records and geological data to understand if a subtle shift in the river's flooding behavior contributed to Egypt's slow decline. Was the lifeblood of the empire becoming less predictable just as the kingdom needed it most? Each dig, each satellite survey, and each laboratory breakthrough adds another piece to this immense, fragmented mosaic. The debates are lively and essential. Did internal rebellion or external invasion play the larger role at a given site? Was the collapse a rapid 50-year avalanche or a slower century-long crumbling? These are not signs of failure in the field, but proof of its healthy, relentless pursuit of truth. The story of the collapse teaches us a profound lesson about history itself, that the past is never fully settled. It is a conversation across millennia, and with every new question we ask, we learn a little more not only about them, but about the fragile, interconnected nature of our own world. The silence that settled over the ancient world was not a permanent tomb, but a long winter. For 3 centuries, the grand halls of the Mycenaean kings stood empty, the great library of Hattusa lay forgotten, and the pharaohs ruled a diminished realm. This was the Dark Age, a time when the intricate threads of trade, writing, and empire were severed. Yet, even in that long quiet, life persisted. Small communities held on, tending their fields and telling stories of a lost golden age. The collapse of the Bronze Age empires stands as a monumental reminder of the fragility of even the most advanced civilizations. It was a convergence of environmental disaster, economic interdependence, social strain, and human conflict that brought a glittering age to an abrupt and violent end. This was not a simple story of invasion or conquest. It was a systems failure where a changing climate weakened the foundations, where brittle social structures cracked under pressure, and where the very interconnectedness that made them strong became the channel for their mutual ruin. Their world, so confident and sophisticated, proved vulnerable to a perfect storm of crises. But the most profound lesson of this ancient catastrophe is not about endings. It is about renewal. From this prolonged darkness emerged entirely new worlds, forged in the crucible of that collapse. The rigid, palace-centered hierarchies were gone, and in their absence, different kinds of societies could take root. The Phoenicians, no longer vassals, looked to the open sea and built a decentralized commercial network that would circle the Mediterranean. In the hills of Canaan, free from imperial overlords, tribal communities coalesced into kingdoms whose spiritual legacy would eventually circle the globe. And in the scattered villages of Greece, the long period of localism and self-reliance slowly gave birth to the idea of the citizen and the city-state, the very seeds of classical civilization. These were not direct descendants of the old empires, but something new, shaped by the hard lessons of survival. They were the iron-wielding societies that would define the first millennium before the Common Era, built on more dispersed and in some ways more resilient foundations. This story teaches us that collapse is not always a final end, but often a brutal and transformative reorganization. It is a historical process where old structures break apart, making space for new forms of life, thought, and power to emerge. The silence after the fall was not empty, it was full of potential. The echoes of this disaster, 3,000 years old, now resonate with a new urgency in our own hyper-connected age. We have built a global civilization of dazzling complexity and profound interdependence, one that bears a striking resemblance to the club of the great powers. We, too, rely on fragile supply chains, face environmental pressures, and navigate deep social strains. Their story challenges us to look at our interconnected world with both humility and foresight. It asks us to consider where our own single points of failure might lie, and to build not just for efficiency but for resilience. The past does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. By listening to the echoes from the end of the Bronze Age, we are not hearing a prophecy of doom, but receiving a timeless manual for vigilance, reminding us that the greatest test of any civilization is not how it shines in its golden age, but how it weathers the inevitable storm.